Welcome back, everybody. We'll get underway now for the Improving Social Infrastructure stream this morning. My name is Sarah Lang from Infrastructure New Zealand, and I am delighted to be leading this session this morning. I hope you are feeling refreshed and caffeined up as we have a crunchy session ahead. I also know that I closed the bar tab off last night and didn't get home until 2:30, so some of you may be feeling a bit like me. Anyway, good morning everybody. This year more than ever has shone a spotlight on the social infrastructure we all rely on but often take for granted, such as hospitals and schools. The time we have all spent at home this year and the somewhat unexpected surge in the housing market has further highlighted the need for more and better quality housing. New Zealand has some of the highest qualified and skilled medical professionals and educators in the world, but there is no question that in terms of facilities, there is a lot we could improve on. So how do we make best use of the stimulus investment available to us to create schools, healthcare facilities and homes that not only serve the needs of New Zealanders now, but set us up for the kind of future we want to create? In the upcoming session, we are going to hear from the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Education and Kāinga about their respective infrastructure challenges and plans for the future, before we conclude with a panel discussion debating actually how we're going to pay for this new and improved infrastructure. Social infrastructure is inherently linked to well-being, and perhaps nowhere more visibly than the health sector. Earlier this year, the Ministry of Health released the National Asset Management Program for District Health Boards, which showed that many of our hospitals are no longer fit for purpose, with significant infrastructure deficiencies and are technologically behind the times. With a fix-it bill estimated at $14 billion, we will need some creative approaches to solve the problem. I'd now like to welcome Karl Wilkinson, the Director of Project Delivery, and Chris Fry, the Director of Capital Investment, both from the Health Infrastructure Unit at the Ministry of Health, to share an update on the state and future of our health infrastructure. Welcome, gentlemen.
Tēnā koutou katoa, and a very good morning to you. I am Karl Wilkinson, as Sarah said, Director of Health Infrastructure Program Delivery.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, ko Danino, te pai mona, ko Yarra, te iwi, te awa, te Wiradjuri, te iwi, te Melbourne, te kāna, ko Chris Fry, taku winiwa. My name is Chris Fry, and with Karl, we are the directors of the Health Infrastructure Unit, which was recently created about 12 months ago to try and address some of the challenges in the health sector for providing infrastructure, support, service and planning. I'd like to say first off, thank you for investing all your time with us so that we can learn, share and understand what needs to be done together. Healthcare is something that we all require through our lives and crosses paths in our lives, not always when we most expect it. We all hope that the time that we engage with the health sector is done in a manner that is not only productive in the outcomes, but is done in a very supportive and easy time for all those involved. But that isn't always the case. And so the premise I'll be putting to you today is that we need, for the health of the system, the health of the country, and how we engage with infrastructure, the people in this room, the people in this symposium, we put ourselves firstly in the shoes of those that are engaging with the health system. People, all of us in this room, or indeed whānau that we know will have serious engagements with the health system sometime through the journey of their life. It could be like needing a heart transplant. It could be handling the challenges and the rigours of cancer treatment, or in fact a car accident that puts them in hospital, and sometimes for a very long period of time. As I said, everyone in this room has whānau, or indeed themselves, touched in this way. But also reflect that engaging with hospitals and the infrastructure and the people that support the service care can also be a time of joy. A joy related to birth of children, the joy of becoming well again after periods of long illness or accident or pain. But whatever the scenario, the outcome for the people is driven by the service of the care we provide and is driven for the people. The community should be proud and they should be confident of the service that they can expect and get delivered, and indeed of the infrastructure that supports it. And I make that point consistently, that the infrastructure is important, but it is the enabler for the outcomes, not for the infrastructure itself. So today we're going to share with you our views from the Health Infrastructure Unit on what we are looking to do differently to support the health infrastructure and the delivery of health service in this country. And it's based around three premises. The first one is it needs to be people-centric. We need to be looking more and more at the core of service planning, and it needs to be future-focused. Imagine someone you know, someone who's dear to you. Just for a moment, consider someone, as I said, is dear to you that might be suffering from severe depression and is in need of treatment. It may take some time. That individual may be in the care of the health system for some time. But also reflect that parents, friends, whānau, children would all want to engage with that, helping that individual through their journey. They want to know that they're in good hands. They want to know the individual and the person you care for is comfortable away from home and has a pathway coming back to a life that they had enjoyed. The healthcare environment, including infrastructure, actually plays a critical role in that pathway of journey back to well-being. And we need, all of us need, to ensure that the care and comfort is for people. We can provide empathy, we can provide security and confidence of the care and the support for your individual that you're thinking of. That it's family and whānau centred, enabling whānau to be part of the journey, sharing with that individual back to full recovery. And importantly, needs to be culturally responsive to the community and the people in our care, because that actually has been proven to have significant health benefits and outcomes. Facilities need to be of the kind that match the service of care offering and match the models of care that we are moving towards, and increasingly proven to be more effective. And also, finally, the facilities need to reflect and enable the workforce and enable them to shift their patterns of work and what they're trying to achieve. The foundation of this, and getting it right from the start, is around service planning, which brings together the community's health needs and how best to put those models of care to support the health needs of the community. A recent example of a new approach, and one that we are proud of and is in this city, is the Te Ao Mai Mental Health Centre at Counties Manukau. And this is a picture of what we're looking at here. This was opened earlier in the year, and then second stage in September. It is a 76-bed mental health unit. But in some ways, it's the very inverse of what many of us in this room, myself included, had expected, and how we perceive a mental health facility that looks after some of the most vulnerable people in our community. 76 beds, each of those individuals in that care has their own single individual bed and ensuite facility. Each person has a view out of their bedroom into the wider environment outside, and the core of the building is structured around 7 courtyards in the centre of the area and has far more open space, lines of sight. And that's been done very, very specifically and was created from the start of understanding the health needs of the people that we're trying to bring to a full recovery. There are more open spaces so staff can see the patients, which then brings benefits around safety, but also for the patients a sense of openness, a sense of not being trapped in dark corners. There is greater flexibility to enable youth and older patients to be able to be moved around and have a pathway of recovery in a far better way. They're secure units, so staff and patients in a soft security environment, but far more superior security environment, are more at ease and feeling far more confident. It's light and airy in treatments. Importantly, at the entrance, there's a pharé as patients come through. So historically, in many of our mental health facilities around the country, the experience for the patients is through a roller door, through the back exit, and a lot of heavy security. Again, this is the inverse. It's through the pharé and it's totally culturally appropriate and reflects the community. The point I'm trying to make here is that service planning is the critical first step. We need to think and understand the service planning before we start thinking about the design of the infrastructure. The infrastructure is important. It's one we're very proud of, the infrastructure, but it is not the end in itself, but its primary aim of infrastructure is to enable the outcomes for the people. And I think we need to acknowledge and confront that our health system is under pressure and speed is of the essence. We have pressing outcomes in the health sector. We have a very strong, well-developed public health sector that we should and need to recognise and be proud of. But we have an ageing population, and with that we also have complex needs. People are living longer. I had a moment of reflection putting this presentation together. I'm now in that demographic at the top end, not the bottom end. I'm part of the system, and I need to look forward to what it will do for me. Many Kiwis enjoy good health, but inequities still remain, particularly for Māori, Pacifica and vulnerable groups in our care. Importantly, the state of our health capital is such that our infrastructure also needs to support the health system, and our infrastructure is equally under stress. As mentioned earlier by Sarah, in June this year we released for the very first time a study of the state of our key infrastructure, our health infrastructure across the country. That was the National Asset Management Plan. And it looked at the holistic view of what is the current status for our current need of our system. And what it found is about $14 billion of infrastructure for supporting the health system is required for current needs right now. So there is much work to be done. We must maintain the momentum and we must push forward that momentum, but it needs to be done in a balanced way. And it needs to be premised on strategic planning, strategic long-term service planning, so we make the right decisions, so money is spent in the right places for the next generations to come. It needs to be founded on a people-centric view. And I'll pass over to Karl to outline how we are looking to do that in the current time.
Thanks, Chris. So Chris has outlined the need to put people at the centre of our approach, and clearly the stress across our system. The health estate that supports that system is valued at around $24 billion, which is one of the largest single estates in our country. So it's really important that we get that right. The great news is progress is being made. With the establishment of the Health Infrastructure Unit around this time last year, we're working really hard to address a number of the key challenges that Chris has touched on. Some of those include a real need to get a better link between capital investment needs with delivering improved outcomes, health outcomes, so we can make that direct linkage. Chris touched on one of the key mechanisms there, which is getting that really robust upfront service planning. So how are health services going to be delivered in the future that best meet the population's needs? And then from there, we can build out the strategy for how to deliver the infrastructure that supports that. Bringing more consistency and speed to the prioritisation, planning and delivery of projects through more national oversight and effective governance. In essence, what that means is a simpler and clearer pathways for decision making. It's quite a devolved system, and so with a number of different entities all involved in that decision making at the moment, it does take time, and we think there's some work that can be done there, and we're progressing that. Building central capability to support the planning and delivery of projects through national standards and approaches to health service planning and delivery. Supporting those DHBs who often don't have the specialist expertise to deliver large capital projects. District Health Board's primary objective is to deliver health services for their community, and some or many of them haven't delivered or won't have delivered in this generation a major capital project. So our goal in the work that we're doing is to build centralised capability and capacity there that we can support those DHBs with that. And critically, this is not just about replacing facilities like for like. So as Chris mentioned, the $14 billion number reflects if we were to wave our magic wand and replace the infrastructure today, that's what we would need. But we're looking to the future. We need to do things better and smarter and ensure that we take that future into account. So what have we got at the moment? Committed investment to date is around $4.7 billion is our active pipeline of projects. That includes projects you would have heard yesterday, New Dunedin Hospital, New Zealand's largest vertical build project ever, and certainly our largest hospital build project. Recently completed Te Nikau Hospital on the West Coast, Christchurch Hospital Waipapa. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but I'm delighted that that's open to the public this week, which putting people at the centre is why we're all here. We've also got the next phase of Taranaki Base Hospital, $300 million upgrade there, and $300 million investment through the New Zealand Upgrade Program, which is progressing through, as well as a number of key projects across this northern region and right across Aotearoa. This is the start of a long program to restore and rebuild health infrastructure, which the Ministry's Health Infrastructure Unit, in partnership with the District Health Boards, is progressing. One key area just to touch on here is a focus in mental health. Over $400 million has been invested in upgrading mental health and addiction facilities across the country. Chris touched on one of those, and I'd like to acknowledge the really hard work and the vision of Counties Manukau DHB that led that project and delivered it. There are 16 projects currently being progressed under the mental health program, and we're piloting a new model of support and delivery for these. Not surprisingly, most of these projects have similar problems and are seeking similar outcomes, so it stands to reason that bringing those together and sharing and learning collectively to deliver those will be more efficient and a more effective way of doing it. We're leveraging our expertise in the HIU and wider, applying a nationwide lens and working more closely with those district health boards to support their planning and project delivery. Quicker delivery of fit-for-purpose mental health facilities makes a massive difference to our clients, our whānau and our staff. And as you saw earlier, they support more contemporary models of care that provide more therapeutic environment and ultimately support people to get well and stay well. So in partnerships, this is clearly a massive task. And clearly, we can't do this alone. We need the support of the sector and the industry to make this happen and keep it moving at pace. This requires strong partnerships built on understanding of the challenges that we're all facing, and that requires relationships and communication. We're working to build these partnerships through, for example, the construction sector in Cord and our involvement there, leading market sounding and construction sector engagement through the Dunedin Hospital project earlier this year to bring forward construction expertise into the early phases of design and cement those relationships and commitment with the local workforce, the national workforce that we need to deliver this program. We've worked with MB to stand up Workforce Central Dunedin, and we're driving hard to support the engagement and upskilling of future industry capability in schools. We heard some about that last night. This is now extending to programs with Otago Polytechnic and local schools in the Dunedin area. We're test bedding an induction approach for our entire project that pushes far beyond the typical. Workforce Central promotes open opportunity for upskilling of literacy, and really importantly, we've identified for this project as a digital hospital of the future, digital skills for that workforce that will deliver the project, and equally personal resistance. I'm really proud of the mahi and commitment from our team. Special mention to Andy Cohen, who I see is here today, from MB and the Mates in Construction team for really pushing forward on this really important piece of work. We're also connecting across other agencies here and abroad to share the tools, lessons, and most importantly, the relationships that will underpin these partnerships in getting this right. Ross from Infocom touched yesterday on some of the work that we've started with Infocom in this space too. I'll just touch on the asset management program. So Chris and Sarah both touched on this. As a direct follow-on from the earlier work in the current state assessment, we're working closely now with DHBs in partnership to develop a consistent risk and assurance framework. And what this seeks to do is provide a shared and consistent approach for DHBs to understand, better communicate and manage the inherent risks that exist in their infrastructure at all levels of the organisation. We've piloted this now with 2 DHBs and have 2 more lined up, chomping at the bit, so to speak, to work with us over the coming weeks. So that's really exciting work. We couldn't stand here as a Ministry of Health without mentioning COVID, could we? So that brings me to the future. Many or most of you will recognise this scene here on the screen. It has been a time of uncertainty, and it's been an emotional time. This global pandemic has highlighted our collective need as a population to be agile, maintain resilience, and focus on the opportunities. And I believe that it has also brought out the best in us and shown our readiness to work in unity. How can we make the most of this disruption? Well, we're proposing that we leverage those learnings and we build these into our approach going forward. In our health system, as an example, phone and video health consults became commonplace through the COVID lockdown. Just a few basic stats. So pre-lockdown, we had 7 DHBs that averaged total around 250 video consults per week in total. During lockdown, this jumped to over 2,000 video consults per week across 12 DHBs. There are 20 DHBs in total. That's a 700% increase within the space of a few days in phone and video consults. Post-lockdown, that's now settled back to about 870, and the important thing is the uptake has lifted to 16. Now, clearly, video consults won't displace in-person consults and care in all cases, but it does demonstrate that there is a pathway for a role in technology in shifting the way that health is delivered. Critically, these lessons will not just be about building bigger, shinier and faster. It's about aligning and driving future shifts in health services, like bringing services closer to the people, or making services mobile, or leveraging technology that will underpin the health system response. And one example there is the announcement and development of linear accelerators across the regional areas of the hospital that we know are going to save people a 4-hour round trip for their health care because it brings it closer to them. So in closing, planning our hospitals around people is going to need to involve the engagement with people, communities, our health workforce, and the infrastructure sector, everyone in this room. We're underway, we're making good progress, and there's work to be done. A representation of where we're heading is the new Waipapa building at Christchurch Hospital, which opened, as I mentioned earlier, this week, and I'm extremely proud of the entire team involved and the partnerships that made this happen. This provides a place of community connection, healing, and enduring relationships. A tangible or tactile example and a constant reminder of that connection with the community is the centrepiece that you see on the screen here and the timber panelling, which was crafted by local craftspeople and recovered and from timber recovered from the actual site. I hope you'll agree it's a huge step forward from the sterile institutional hospital environments of our past and creates an environment that will encourage and promote people to seek health where it's needed. This will be a great place for the Canterbury community to receive treatment and heal that instills confidence, trust through whatever the future may bring. And this future is likely to include greater investment in digital infrastructure alongside physical infrastructure and in community-based facilities, not just large hospitals. Thanks for your attention, and we look forward to the discussion that follows.
Thanks very much, Chris and Karl. People, we really did get 2 for the price of 1 there. I had spoken with Karl and really said to him, you know, we love you, Karl, and we love Chris, but we probably love Ashley more. Thanks for stepping in Ashley's footsteps. You are a close second. Yeah. Look, healthcare is, of course, critical, but so too is quality education. I think this year parents have appreciated the skills and experience of teachers more than ever, as we have tried to wrap our heads around algebra and physics while schooling our kids from home. But has COVID-19 and the shift towards more remote learning shown that it's time for new approaches to how we deliver education? Here to shed some light on the state and future of our schools is Alison Murray, Director of Commercial Procurement, Education Infrastructure Services at the Ministry of Education. Please join me in welcoming Alison. Oh, the click is there. I'll use this one.
Tēnā koutou katoa kui hui maine. No ingana o tupuna. I whanau mai aho, Easto Contrent. Ko Alison Murray, toka ingoa. Kei te tahuhu o te mataranga, ahu e mahiana. He poto mo whiwhiana aho. I'm Alison Murray, and I'm the Director of Procurement for Education Infrastructure Services. I'm here today to talk to you about how the Ministry of Education is investing in the future of our schools' infrastructure. But first, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background to the group that I work within the Ministry, because infrastructure is about property, but it's slightly wider. So EIS, or Education Infrastructure Service, was set up in 2013, mainly to manage the Crown's school property portfolio. And as well as school property, we're also responsible for the largest payroll in the country, and we're also the second largest purchaser of passenger transport, and we help over 100,000 students to get to school every day. A few big numbers on there. We might talk about some of those numbers in a second. So in terms of school property, this service was offered by ES has grown enormously since when it was first created in 2013. So I think I can maybe trump you slightly, Ministry of Health. We're the second largest property portfolio, and Kāinga was going to probably beat me next by telling me that they're the largest. So we have the largest social property portfolio in the country with a replacement value of over 31 billion. And we support 2,100 state schools to maintain more than 15,000 school buildings. So following the 1989 education reform, Tomorrow's Schools, and before EIS was created, it was and is still the responsibility of School Board of Trustees to maintain the school property. And while some schools have done this really well, others have struggled. So one of the biggest challenges for school infrastructure, therefore, is the fact that we have an ageing property portfolio with more than 33% of all buildings that were first built between 40 and 50 years ago. So our role now has been working with these schools that haven't been well maintained and to address what are some very complex legacy property issues. So as EIS, we manage all the large and complex infrastructure projects. And this currently amounts to about 70% of projects by value. And this is up from about 25% in 2010. It's the responsibility of schools to manage the remaining projects, which deliver most of those projects by volume, a lot smaller in value and a lot less complex. To give you so those projects for schools may be a few thousand up to maybe a million or so. But then Education Infrastructure Service manage those projects, which can range from a few 100,000 up to tens and hundreds of millions. And historically, we've also put in place 3 PPPs. So it gives you a range, and I'm trying to give you some size of complexity in terms of our infrastructure requirements. It's not, it ranges from very small to very large, and managing that pipeline is an extremely difficult challenge. In addition to the challenge of that historic portfolio, we also estimate that we're going to need a further 100,000 student places in high-growth population areas by 2030, and this is not insignificant in itself. The ministry's purpose is to shape an education system that delivers equitable and excellent outcomes. And we have a target that all schools are having quality learning environments by 2030. In June, we published the Taki Rauakura 2030, the School Property Strategy 2030, which provides the direction for how we will achieve those quality learning environments. Now, if you do want to have a look at this, this is on our, I'm giving a plug, it's on our education website. You can get much more detail there. But the strategy sets out the long-term direction for how we'll manage school property to support that government's target of quality learning environments by 2030. It provides the framework for any improvements that the Ministry will make and our continued effort to support schools to manage school property effectively. The strategy has 4 key objectives, and these are quality learning environments, so that school property meets the agreed standards to support schools and teachers to succeed. It's a sustainable portfolio where the policies, planning and investment optimise long-term social, environmental and economic benefits. That's well managed, that everyone understands their role and how to manage school property and are supported to deliver that. And has, in fact, for this one for me is the most important, has equitable outcomes, that diversity is recognised and schools and students with the greatest needs are prioritised. In 2019 and 20 financial year, we spent more than $1 billion we spent more than $1 billion on school property. And we're forecasting this year to have an even greater spend than that. And this is to progressively improve the condition of schools to ensure that school property is well maintained. Last year, we also had the school investment package, which was a one-off capital injection of $400 million for all state schools to accelerate planned upgrades. In addition, a 3-year work programme is currently underway to upgrade classrooms of up to 600 small and remote schools with a budget of $160 million. Now, this programme focuses on improving the condition of classrooms for learners, and those improvements target key aspects of the learning environment, and these are linked to fitness for purpose, operational efficiency and condition. So some of those elements are RCDs, LED lighting, acoustic panelling, things which might seem minor but actually makes a huge difference to those learning environments for children. Our National School Redevelopment Programme was set up to upgrade schools with the most complex property infrastructure needs. For this programme, we're taking an evidence-based approach, so using our condition assessment and asset plans to prioritise the investment according to those schools with the most urgent need. as you can imagine, we have a huge range of schools that have a differing level of requirements, and that pipeline and that prioritisation of investment is one of our greatest challenge, and that's why we're having to take a more evidence-based approach to ensure that we target the needs where it's most applicable. It's important to remember that we're also investing in schools on an annual basis. We provide over $250 million a year directly to schools to help them to maintain their school property. One of the key aspects when looking at our investment in schools, particularly around new schools and new classrooms, is around having a priority to make sure the strategy for school design is there to make sure that we do achieve those quality learning environments. So as part of that, we've looked to create a suite of reference designs. And I'm going to cheat a little bit now. So rather than listen to me, I'm going to get you to watch a bit of a video, and then I'll just talk a little bit about it after. Yes? No?
Our purpose is to shape an education system that delivers excellent outcomes and excellent outcomes. The School Property Strategy 2030 sets our direction for ensuring we have a sustainable school portfolio where all schools have access to quality learning environments. By 2030, one way we can ensure all schools have access to quality learning environments is by using our school teaching block reference designs.
School designs that we know have delivered consistent quality outcomes, durable built. Here in New Zealand, we face particular challenges with our buildings. Seismic activity, high ultraviolet light, which degrades our building products and makes them break down. High rainfall. In some areas, we're facing coastal erosion, and even risk of tsunami. There is even geothermal activity, which can be very corrosive on foundations. These reference designs generally have strong steel portal frames that resist, and they can be built bigger and stronger for schools in more severe earthquake zones. Our school designs are using a lot of locally grown timber. It's versatile and resilient, and our extensive renewable forests act as a carbon sink, offsetting our carbon footprint. We're continuing to expand our reference designs.
We're using different materials, building our supply chains, and evaluating them to make sure they're delivering quality, which most importantly are great teaching and learning environments. These designs are our first choice for building upgrades, and they'll help us meet our targets for 2030 and beyond.
As I said, I cheated. It's better to get somebody else to talk than you. I think why I wanted to show the video, though, was it's useful to actually see the schools. I could stand here and talk to you, but one, you get to see what some of those new school environments look like. But I think the interesting fact about the video is it talks about some of the challenges we face when we're looking at our investment, which is not only around those school sites. Every school site is different and has a different challenge in terms of where it is, whether its location near to water in an urban environment. But also it's important that the school and the local community have a say in terms of what their school, the look and feel and what that delivers. But reference designs allows us to have a standard approach which is adaptable for the location, the community and the school in terms of their pedagogy. Another area which we've been looking into is, or not looking into, we've actually developed and are now implementing, is modular buildings. And this is one of our quickest and most affordable property solutions. Because modular buildings can be delivered on average in just 6 months, they can be used quickly to respond to those challenges we face, such as role growth, or in a crisis such as earthquake, flooding, or fire. They require less maintenance than traditional classrooms and have an intended lifespan of 50 plus years, which is the same as some of our traditional classroom buildings. Modular buildings meet and in some cases exceed all of the ministry design standards. Okay, so I am kind of full. I feel like we should have compared our notes a little bit, Karl. So in terms of needing to keep improving the portfolio and to deliver against this significant pipeline of projects, we recognise that we do need to work with industry to deliver on the required investment of 12 billion by 2030. The Prime Minister yesterday, and Karl, no, the Prime Minister yesterday mentioned that building back better, procurement cannot be the race to the bottom. And look, for education, I acknowledge historically we have been seen as an agency as an unfair balance of risk in our contracts and our focus on the lowest price. But we recognised early on in our journey as EIS the importance of industry and suppliers to help us to deliver on our strategic objectives. We started, as I said, 6 years ago in terms of how we engage with industry and suppliers and changing our procurement approach. And a key element of this change is that we do work hard to understand and to listen to industry. So I do want to give a bit of a shout out for the construction sector accord. At this point, it is a joint commitment from government and industry to work together to create a high-performing construction sector for better New Zealand. We're a signatory of the accord, and as a major construction client, we're also a member of a number of the various groups and forums of the accord. An important focus of the accord programme is to improve culture within the sector, and that's both on the client and the supplier side. And we're really proud to be a part of this shared commitment. And my challenge to you is that you need to get involved. This change can only happen when everyone commits to the behaviours and actions that are in the accord. And if you haven't done so already, go and find out about it. That's my promotion for the accord today. So, and of course, I'm from procurement, so I'm going to finish off with a few procurement things. And this is related in terms of how we're changing how we deliver the investment for school property. So as I said, we've worked really hard over the last few years in changing our approach. And that one of those changes around the risk in our contracts, not only our professional services, but also for our main contractors as well. We wanted to make sure that those terms were fit for purpose, relevant and fair. We see that it's essential for education to be a client of choice in the market because, let's face it, capacity in the market is still a big challenge now and in the future. And if we need to deliver education infrastructure, we need the market to be there with us. We're looking to move from more of a transactional approach to a much more strategic approach. And we're using our existing supplier arrangements to help us to do that. We've worked hard at identifying our pipeline of work and looking to share that with industry and much more detail and a longer plan than we've ever done before. We currently are looking at 100 projects with a value of 170 million, which we're looking to package up and deliver through our strategic supplier relationships. And the packaging of work is either in an area of a region or over a period of time. And how we're doing that is actually talking to those suppliers to say, what's the best way to arrange these 100 projects? In which way and in which timescales. So we're not just going out to market and saying, here you go, this is what you're going to deliver. We're asking them how we deliver it and which timescales and how best to phase them. Taking this approach will help us to drive more consistent outcomes. It'll enable suppliers to invest in their businesses and their people and supports those procurement outcomes. Our intent is to use our size and scale to support the construction market consistently now and in the long term. We're looking to engage early with suppliers in more collaborative contract arrangements. And some examples of these, and I think this was touched on yesterday by Infracom, although I missed that session, is the Marlborough schools, but we're also, which we're currently in the tender process for, but we also have done this arrangement in terms of new primary schools in the Auckland region. I could probably talk about procurement stuff forever and ever, but I won't. And a bit like Karl, it's been a long journey for us, but there's also much more opportunity to improve and innovate with industry. So hopefully I've given you this morning a little of insight into school property, the size, the scale of the portfolio, the challenges that we're facing in managing that portfolio, and to continue to meet the demand and prioritisation of investment. We need to make sure that our strategy is flexible and can continue to adapt to the challenges that we face. It's essential that we are also there to build back better, not only for our children now, but for future generations to come. Thank you for your time this morning. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tatua katoa.
Thanks very much, Alison, and I'd encourage you all after the session to come and have a chat with the table, with Alison, with Chris and with Karl. So we've talked about healthcare and schooling, and now it is time to look at housing. Warm, safe, affordable housing should be a basic human right, but there's no doubt, after Shamabel's presentation this morning, that in New Zealand this is one area we are really failing. All 8 of New Zealand's housing markets are considered severely unaffordable, and our rates of homelessness are some of the highest in the OECD. So what can be done? Vui Mark Gosche, Chair of Kāinga Ora, Homes and Communities, will now update us on progress of the largest state housing build program in decades, which aims to make better use of land and better reflect how tenants and families live now. Please join me in welcoming Vui. Thank you.
Kia ora, talofa lava, and welcome. That was a rather challenging introduction in terms of the state of our housing markets. But I am Vui Mark Gosche, the Chair of Kāinga Ora, Homes and Communities, and coincidentally I'm also the Chair of Counties Manukau DHB, and thank you for the Ministry of Health people for highlighting one of those wonderful projects. Didn't have a completely smooth delivery, but we're very pleased with the outcome that you've highlighted today. So today I'll outline how Kāinga Ora came about and what we do currently and where we're headed. Finally, I'll talk about how we're going to work in partnership in the urban development space. And I also want to do a little bit about, in the presentation, as to why this is so important to us as a society, not just as people here with an industry interest. The establishment of Kāinga Ora about a year ago represents the biggest institutional and legislative change to housing and urban development for a generation, bringing together the 3 organisations and functions. The impact we've been asked to have on New Zealand and New Zealanders' lives is far broader than our previous roles. The 6 outcomes we're responsible for are on the slide. These were co-developed by the 3 legacy agencies and the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development. Some of this work is well underway. For some outcomes, we're just getting out of the starting blocks. First of all, you'll know us best as New Zealand's largest residential landlord, providing tenancy services to around 187,000 public housing customers and maintaining around 66,000 public houses. Our operations as a public housing landlord have been refined and improved over a long period, but there are still significant developments in this space. We've got the biggest build program for a generation, a significant spike in demand for public housing, and we have a focus on wellbeing imperatives. This slide, if you can see it, I hope, outlines some facts and figures about our assets and our customers. You'll receive the presentation so you can look through these at your leisure. But two things to note. Our applicant and customer base has changed significantly over the years, from mostly nuclear families to larger families, sole parents with children, and single-person households. This has led to an oversupply of the standard 3-bedroom houses and an undersupply of smaller 1 or 2-bedroom houses and larger houses with 4 or more bedrooms, resulting in both overcrowding and underutilisation. Household crowding is the main driver of infectious diseases such as rheumatic fever. These diseases are a significant reason for hospitalisations. The second aspect is that many of our customers have high and complex needs, such as loneliness, mobility issues, or are faced with challenges in mental health, addiction, or family violence. We want to provide those with specific needs with a tailored service or home so they live well in their communities. Some metrics on our current housing delivery and investments are on this slide. New Zealand research has shown, for instance, that ACC payments can be reduced by about 1/3 by remediating existing homes. We have committed to an initial $500 million investment to bring our older homes up to modern standards by lifting the thermal efficiency through insulation, ventilation and effective heating. We'll make the homes fit for purpose by opening them up and making as many as possible more accessible. Our retrofit investment not only provides warm, dry, healthy homes for our customers and reduces the risks of home injuries, but also provides significant investment in jobs for the regional economies where these homes are located. And I want to acknowledge my fellow speakers, Karl, Chris and Alison, from the two ministries. Health, education and housing are the bedrock of New Zealand society with deep interdependencies. The main effects of housing on health and wellbeing have been determined by the WHO in 2018 as household crowding, cold and damp, excessive heat, hazards in the household leading to falls and accessibility issues. Cold and damp in existing housing, which leads to mould, is caused by lack of insulation and heating and poor ventilation, which leads to increased risk of respiratory infections, cardiovascular and infectious illnesses. Unsafe homes contribute to higher rates of slips, trips and falls, noting that the main tenant is 65 in over almost a quarter of our state housing tenancies. Injuries from trips and falls in the home are responsible for most ACC payments. There's strong evidence that improving housing quality significantly improves a range of health and social outcomes, particularly educational. For our younger residents, the stability of a family home via a state home with security of rental tenure is key to kids' educational attainment. Improved health through insulation and heating means fewer absences from school, and secure tenancies in healthy homes help to ensure that families can stay in one home for longer, so children have continuity in schooling, build secure relationships at school, and benefit from learning. I'll update you a bit on our apprenticeship program, where we're placing trainees with build and development partners while providing them with the support they need to be successful. And our maintenance contractors are also stepping up. By way of example, Spotless provides work experience on Kāinga properties with a special focus on getting Māori, Pasifika and young women into the trades via its Mangere Cadet program. Spotless is also aiming to increase the number of its trade staff in apprenticeships or training from the current 6% to 20% over the term of its contract. And our other contractors throughout New Zealand are opening up opportunities for workers in this area also. Turning to our legislative framework, the Kāinga Homes and Communities Act was passed in September 2019. The Act sets out our functions and operating principles. A second piece of legislation, the Urban Development Act, passed in August this year, is an important tool to enable our urban development role and supports communities to thrive socially and economically. In essence, the Urban Development Act is designed to give Kāinga Ora powers to facilitate development through these mechanisms: shorten planning and consenting processes, funding powers for infrastructure and other development activities, bringing together parcels of land for development, reconfiguring reserves for better use, and protecting Māori urban development interests. The Act establishes a new type of urban development, a specified development project, or SDP. These projects will deliver significant housing supply in high growth areas and ensure growth is planned and managed to give high quality urban outcomes. The Act enables Kāinga Ora to exercise a wide range of development powers with respect to funding, infrastructure provision, land assembly, and planning within these specified development projects. This will provide greater certainty for communities, developers and investors. For most developments, traditional council consenting processes will continue to be the best way to go. But for large and complex projects, for which it is very difficult to make progress under traditional pathways, an SDP may be an option. Kāinga Ora is now open to receiving proposals for SDPs from potential developers. We are putting in place the resources and expertise to carry out our role under the Act. Our role is to assess and evaluate any SDP proposals, then make a recommendation to ministers about establishing the project. Ours is very much a partnership model to facilitate and enable projects, as well as progress our own developments. And you can see more about this on our website. If you have proposals, talk to us early so we can help assess the best planning and consenting pathway. Kāinga Ora has a number of people here from our Urban and Development and Planning team, and if they're in the room and I call out their name, I just ask them to wave out. Caroline McDowell, Claire Kernan, David Cleland, Jeff Mills, David Alison and Giles Bramwell. If they're not here, if they haven't jumped up, Ross Pennington said look out for Kāinga Ora people because they have a glint in their eye. So they are very keen and very capable of asking any of your questions, so please seek them out. Turning to procurement, we have developed a new social and sustainable procurement plan which has 4 broader outcomes in conjunction with commercial outcomes when procuring. 1, consider and provide for Māori interests. 2, empower thriving communities. 3, boost workforce developments and employment opportunities. And 4, be a leader in environmental sustainability. Other ways we're working with the industry to deliver our capital programs include continuity and greater transparency of our pipeline, multi-year contracts to give our suppliers certainty, building skills and capability as per the construction sector accord with over 180 apprentices with our build and development partners and subbies, and bedding down the Mates in Construction program, which has been successful in reducing the suicide rate in Australia's construction industry. New Zealand has the worst, for an industry, the worst suicide rate in construction, and that's a challenge we have to all meet together. And lastly, paying 95% of our invoices within 5 days since the start of COVID-19, which I know a lot of government agencies are trying to do better on, but we have been very good at doing so. Many of you have been involved in the development of our new construction plan, including a workshop at this conference yesterday. The plan, now called Building Momentum, has 5 focus areas of partnering: innovation, sustainability, delivery and design quality. It will help us to improve the way we deliver new state homes and become a centre of excellence for residential construction, and ambition Kāinga Ora is still on a way off achieving. So that's my presentation, and I'm not sure whether I was supposed to be available for questions, but as I said, look out for the people from Kāinga Ora with a glint to their eye. Please approach them and answer many questions. Finally, I'd just like to say, in wrapping up what I think has been a really important session of bringing the three agencies together, I once worked for a fairly important boss by the name of Helen Clark, and Helen Clark, as you know, was a Minister of Housing and a Minister of Health. And she said she did more for the health of New Zealanders in her role as Minister of Housing than she did in her Minister of Health role. So I think it's been good to bring the three organisations together just to show that the reason why we do these things is so important to us as a society. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Kia ora, and thank you very much for your presentation, Vui Mark. I'd like to ask any Ministry of Health, Education or Kāinga Ora staff who are in the session today to please come up to this table here and answer any questions. We didn't have time for questions from the floor today for this. We will have time for questions for the panel, but if you would like to talk to any of the ministry staff or the Kāinga Ora staff, please come up to the table afterwards. So, thank you to all our speakers so far. It's been insightful to hear where we are at and what the future could hold for New Zealand's social infrastructure. But, of course, to deliver world-class infrastructure requires a means to pay for it. So, our next panel will be exploring options for funding and financing social infrastructure. Please welcome our moderator, Laura Harris, the Head of Infrastructure, Government and Specialised Finance at BNZ, and also an Infrastructure New Zealand board member, along with our panellists, Karen Mitchell, Principal Consultant at Advisian, Peter Murray, GM of Major Projects and Advisory at the Infrastructure Commission, Hugh Kettle, Partner Bell Gully, and Nahui Alation, Commercial Advisor, Crown Infrastructure Partners. What a power panel. Please welcome them to the stage.
Oh, I'll go in the end. Yeah. Oh, is it mine? Power panel, no pressure, guys. Morena e te whānau. It's fantastic to have the New Zealand infrastructure community or family here together over the last couple of days and in person. Thanks again, as Sarah mentioned, a great night of festivities last night, so thank you for making it here today. Thank you also, especially to those joining us online. It would have been a very different 2020 for all of us if Crown Infrastructure Partners hadn't been so successful at rolling out UFB across New Zealand. We heard yesterday about the challenges of funding our future, and on this panel we'll discuss funding and financing challenges for social infrastructure, in particular schools, hospitals and public housing. As we've heard from the other speakers in the session this morning, like other infrastructure assets, our social infrastructure requires a significant amount of funding to rectify a historic underinvestment in this sector. On the other hand, there is an enormous amount of funds under management or financing around the globe that is looking for long-term investments, offering secure returns in politically stable countries like New Zealand. Social infrastructure assets are intergenerational assets and require intergenerational financing, and with low interest rates and a limitation on how much more the government can borrow relative to GDP, we need to utilise more financing tools and learn from existing tools that work very well in New Zealand, such as LGFA's financing program for local authorities, Kāinga Ora's wellbeing borrowing program, and dare I say it, public-private partnerships that are delivering social outcomes at a lower cost than the public sector comparators. So I'll start the panel off with a couple of questions, but please do send yours through on the app, and we can see how we go today. Peter, I might kick off with you from your experience from the many transactions across the ditch. In the assessment of funding of projects, do we fully consider the social objectives, of the social outcomes, of social infrastructure?
The answer to that would be no. And I think one of the critical challenges when you're talking about funding social infrastructure is to understand what social outcome you want to achieve. I think that's one of the key problems. And if I think about some examples, which I'm happy to explore, that a lot of the times we don't really think through the social outcomes we want to achieve from the social infrastructure. We do with economic infrastructure, and I think that's the distinction I want to make. With economic infrastructure, I just remember going into Transport for New South Wales and someone proudly had a photo up of the M7 motorway before and after. And they clearly understood what they wanted to achieve from that piece of infrastructure. But with social infrastructure, a lot of the times the outcomes that are achieved are not necessarily what was intended at the beginning.
And does then good social infrastructure incentivise intended social outcomes?
Some of the times the outcomes you get from social infrastructure are not what was written in the business case. And I think of a couple of examples, and I apologise, I've only been in New Zealand this year, so my examples will be across the ditch. But for example, the Alexander McConaughey Centre, which is Canberra's prison. So if you look at the outcomes that project achieved, they weren't ones that were written into the business case. So to give you an idea of what this prison looks like, you walk into the low security section and you go in there and there's a flat screen TV, there's a lounge, there's a kitchen where the prisoners cook their own meals. Each prisoner has their own room. So you've got a really human rights compliant prison. But what outcome did you get out of that prison? Well, what you got was an increase in the incarceration rates, because no longer were the judiciary sending prisoners to Goulburn, to a prison that was called the Killing Fields. They're sending them to a human rights compliant prison. As a result, we got outcomes that weren't intended originally when the social infrastructure was contemplated and delivered. The same thing I can say about another social infrastructure asset, which was Frampton Early Childhood School. Probably traumatising people in Canberra in infrastructure right now. But that was an incredibly expensive and extremely attractive school. It had a sculptural courtyard. Each classroom had its own kitchenette. And as a result, what we got was, again, another outcome that wasn't intended, is that people migrating from New South Wales to the Australian Capital Territory just to send their children to this school. So the point being is that often, some of the times we get, not sometimes, quite often, when we build really high quality social infrastructure, we don't necessarily understand the outcomes we're driving. But the point being is that in those circumstances, you can use social infrastructure to drive social outcomes if you contemplate them up at the time of creating your business case.
Yeah, prison is a very interesting example, because I think Karen, to Auckland South Correctional Facility, or Wiri Prison as it may more commonly be known, that was a very ambitious first PPP for New Zealand that really had social outcomes at the core of the procurement. Is that transactional example that other agencies can learn from?
Well, I certainly think it's an example of, pushing the boat out on outcomes. It was not when we went to market, there was not a high degree of prescription. And I think back now, it's some years ago, that the department at the time was looking for a catalyst for change. It had been stuck in a particular model of prison services, and it was looking to the private sector to bring new ideas, innovation. And, some of the proposals were quite scary in a sense. So the department took very bold move. And at that time, if you think about the discussion today, people are talking about broader outcomes, they're talking about well-being, they're talking about reducing reoffending, they're talking about whole-of-life asset management, they're talking about a whole range of things. No one was talking about that 10 years ago or so when we embarked on that project. So it was hugely innovative. It was, it was a very big move for the department at that time. And but the department itself has changed since then. It has moved on a whole range of outcomes-focused initiatives, new policies and procedures. So, you know, it was an interesting discussion at that time in 2010 to 12 because we anticipated that as the department learnt and as it learnt from the innovation it was seeing, that it would change and then the private sector would change and there'd be this constant sort of growth in new models and new ideas in relation to prison services. And I think that has been a challenge, keeping that up actually.
Thank you. And Hugh, more broadly across the rest of the PPP and social housing reform programs, what do you think the government's learned from its engagement with private financing?
So I think consistent with what Karen said, the PPP program in particular was started off with a real focus on innovation and improving outcomes rather than being a balance sheet tool in New Zealand. I mean, the stated aim of Treasury when the model was adopted over here was to sort of stand on the shoulders of giants, which was the offshore PPP markets that we followed on from, but with quite a different mindset behind it. But I think leaving the contract model to one side, it was the procuring for outcomes that I think the government learnt a lot from, and the overall lift to the standard of procurement within the public sector. I think having the private sector rigour within the procurement process has really lifted the sort of evaluation criteria and the models that we had to put in place to actually rigorously select against the incredibly complex bids that we had to consider. I think other points to bear in mind really are the risk allocation. It is much more rigorous when you've got private sector involvement. I'll talk about this a bit more later on hopefully, but I think you know, there's quite an interesting tension between the PPP type model and the construction sector accord and the way that the markets have moved over the last decade. I think the last point I'll make really is the Crown's learnt a lot about dealing with SPVs. I mean, SPVs are not a solution in themselves. They're sometimes sort of touted as a solution. SPVs are neither good nor evil. They can be either, but inherently that the Crown learnt a lot about what the role of the SPV was. I think we may have been slightly naive at the outset. We've had the spectrum between complete financing pass-through vehicles through to more capitalised and more heavily managed SPVs, and I think the Crown did go on a bit of a journey in terms of ensuring it asked for what it needed in terms of that SPV role.
Thanks. And Nahuia, we've heard from Crown Infrastructure Partners at previous INZ events about the establishment of the IFF legislation. Just as a refresher, what's CIP's role in IFF and what lessons can we learn from previous policy interventions to position it for success?
Kia ora everybody. Yes, so CIP will be playing the role of the facilitator and we will be bringing together what are a range of parties from very different sectors. We'll have the landowners, the developers, the council, the financier, the Treasury, the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, plus all of the consulted departments. So there will be quite a few collaborative parties brought together and we will guide them through the IFF process in the hope that we'll have a structured transaction at the end that is not only beneficial to everyone involved, but is something that Cabinet and Treasury and the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development all feel very comfortable recommending. It's been interesting listening over the past couple of days. It seems like people might be feeling a bit disappointed maybe with the political cycles, that they're so short and it can sometimes hinder the progress we can make with policy. And I think one of the interesting learnings from IFF has been that actually it's been politically supported by both sides pretty much through the whole development of the policy work, and people might not realise that this work actually started under the national government and then was brought in and developed further under the Labour government, and actually that's been really beneficial for us, and having that long-term support from across both political parties has actually helped, I think, to set the model up for it to be more enduring and long-term. So that's been an interesting learning for me, I think.
That's great, thank you. And we've got a few questions coming through, but please do continue to send them through. One that's been asked, and I'll open this up to the whole panel. Wellbeing and outcomes are a clear focus in New Zealand in terms of social infrastructure procurement. But what evidence do we have, or how are agencies actually monitoring that we're delivering on any of those outcomes? Does anyone want to take that?
That's
Karen?
a really good question. I'm guessing we probably aren't. It's not that there aren't. I mean, clearly there are outcomes, social outcomes that arise from schools and building schools and hospitals and prisons. Otherwise, clearly we wouldn't do it. But whether we're explicitly prescribing them at the outset and then explicitly measuring them at some later point in time would only be by proxy. So, who, for example, really can say what the improved health outcomes will be from the acute services building that's just opened in Christchurch. So, because I don't have any idea of what that might be and how we might measure that, and whether in fact that project and the spend on that project and the size of it and the very bespoke nature of its design is actually contributing to a better outcome, or could we have spent some of that money elsewhere? And I know that's quite controversial, but that's the sort of debate that we really need to have.
And I think, at the risk of relabouring my previous point, I mean, you can sit on, I can sit on the Canberra Light Rail project and I can look at the buildings that are being demolished and redeveloped, and I can see with my eyes the outcomes that are being achieved with economic infrastructure. With social infrastructure, I say a project like, I keep using Canberra project, but University of Canberra Public Hospital, we know that people are actually having their lives improved because they're rehabilitating from a car crash, etc. It's really difficult to have a measurement of that. You see it in the community, but it's very difficult just to grab a metric and say that's how we're measuring this.
Points. And Karen, maybe back to you again. How do agencies with limited funding decide between $1 for services or $1 for infrastructure? If infrastructure is never funded as services are the priority, is the strategy in effect run to fail?
Well, yes, probably. Social infrastructure asset management is clearly a run-to-fail strategy. I think, the discussion around the deficit in social infrastructure clearly demonstrates that quite starkly. It's a very tough call. If you have only $1 to spend, are you going to spend it on your asset or are you going to spend it on the patient coming through the door? I think we all know the answer. And the incentives, clearly are, to spend that dollar on the patient. In fact, one of the criticisms of the early private finance initiative PPP projects in the UK, which were largely hospitals, in fact, was that the money to be spent on the asset to maintain it, to ensure that it continued to deliver the level of service that was required, was locked up. And so the true cost of delivering the services was being revealed, but of course it was inadequate. So, that is the daily trade-off that boards that are running social assets essentially have to make every day, and it's a very tough call. So I'm not surprised that a National Asset Management Plan published for health suggests that our health infrastructure is in a dire state. And I worked in and did infrastructure projects for health projects that were Victorian, Edwardian, Georgian. Well, we're talking about facilities in New Zealand that were built, as I recall, the Dunedin Hospital building being built while I was at university in Dunedin. So it's not that long ago, and now we're back into, another, large billion-dollar spend within a generation.
Got another question coming in from the floor for the panel. Are there any good tools outside of PPPs to ensure that our social infrastructure assets are adequately maintained to achieve whole-of-life outcomes? Go for it.
Well, there are other models. So certainly with one of the organisations that are a client of ours, there are other models which can bring the benefits of bundled procurement without necessarily having a finance solution. So it's called a few things, but there's your design, construct, maintain, operate models, which can bring in maintenance and operation. Design, construct, maintain. They can bring a lot of the benefits associated with PPPs without a finance solution, but the people who work in infrastructure finance, of course, wouldn't be highly enthusiastic about such models. but they do exist.
Can I just speak to that one briefly as well? I'd love to see a DBM or similar in practice. I mean, we've talked about it a lot in New Zealand in terms of getting skin in the game for the asset management solution, and have really been unable to find the model that keeps people in there with the long-term incentives without an equity slice in the deal. So I think, you know, if we can develop a DBM model that can be rolled out at scale, that'd be a fantastic tool, other than for the project financiers.
Thanks, Hugh. And on that, I'll follow on with that one then. You did mention before the value that private finance brings from a diligence perspective. In order for the government to attract private capital through a new or revised model for investment for social infrastructure, what should this look like?
I think there's a few elements to this. I mean, it was traditional at this conference to talk about PPP Light, which I won't do. That was put to bed about 5 years ago. One of the questions really, and because I'm not a public servant, I will speak freely, is whether really the PPP model should be dead in the social infrastructure sector. I mean, the issue is to fund and to finance social infrastructure, you need a revenue stream, which is self-evident. It doesn't generate its own revenue stream. And so the question is really whether you would be dressing up the same model in different clothing to create the same sort of model or outcome. So personally, I think that it was a real shame to remove the tool from education, health and other social sectors if you leave the services side out of it. I mean, if you've got an asset-focused project and a focus on AM/FM and whole-of-life costs being transferred to the private sector, that's not traditionally an ideological issue across the world, but it has been made one here, and you know it's a shame to have that currently ruled out, but I suspect it will sit there in the background and things will change over time. In terms of different models, I wish I did have the silver bullet. I think my sort of experience in New Zealand, and I suspect yours is similar, is that the bang for the buck of private investment in these deals has been limited because the pipeline has always been limited by sort of political changes. It's also had, I expect, a bid cost to pay off sort of analysis that wouldn't work over time without the scale of doing these things on a sort of replicated basis. So I think if we can develop something simpler that can be removed from the political side of the spectrum in terms of the pipeline, and to reduce bid costs and to make complete transparency of where the risk allocations sit, that's where we need to look for a model, but I don't have a silver bullet as to actually how you implement that.
Oh, sorry, we're not quite the power panel I think Sarah was looking for. But on that, sorry, Hugh. On that too, I don't think there are many school principals or boards of trustees out there that are saying they want to focus less on education and focus more on the maintenance of the building that they're looking after. Nahuia, another one for you. Perhaps a tired question, but nevertheless one that comes up all the time. Why don't we just borrow more off the Crown's balance sheet?
As the millennial on the panel, I think it can be quite concerning to hear those comments. That can sometimes be said quite flippantly, I think. It's easy to say just borrow and we'll worry about it later, but the reality is somebody eventually does need to pay it back, and like Karen said, you're sacrificing $1 somewhere else to pay that back in the future, and it'll be a different set of people that are either receiving less services or paying a little bit more out of their pay each week, but someone will be paying it back. And I remember when I was an analyst at Treasury in my first 2 years, the Minister of Finance, Minister English, was very focused on getting net debt back to 20%, and we've just heard from the new Secretary to Treasury it's now at 50% of net debt, and the whole building was working on finding every dollar they could to try and reduce that debt. We were selling things, we were cutting services, and so eventually that will happen. Some sacrifice would need to be made by a different generation.
Peter, a more challenging one for you perhaps. Is it appropriate for the private sector to be earning a profit on social infrastructure?
Well, given they earn a loss quite often as well, I'd have to say that it is appropriate. I think in principle, particularly with public-private partnerships, what you want to see, almost in principle with every construction contract, you want to see the private sector earning a reasonable outcome, earning a reasonable profit that gives them a sustainable business model without earning a supernormal profit. And so, unfortunately, there's one project which is quite notorious in the United Kingdom called Fairsakley Prison, where the private sector did earn supernormal profits. And that's something, as a government construction procurement person, I definitely always want to see outcomes where the private sector is earning a reasonable outcome from their projects. I think the point I made at the beginning is that I've been on plenty of PPPs, particular, where the private sector has incurred a loss. So I have no issue whatsoever with them earning a profit. I want them to earn a profit, because if they don't earn a profit, it's not a sustainable business model for government to be in. So it is the healthiest outcome for government, from a government perspective, for the private sector to be earning a reasonable profit. The only time we get concerned, as I said, is where that profit is not a reasonable profit, but that doesn't happen too often. And that's, I guess, the main concern from government, is to ensure that it's in a fair arrangement with the private sector.
Goes to risk allocation, I guess, more broadly, and that the third P of PPP is partnership. So how are we working together?
That's always a theory. But in practice, I think government's got a lot more sophisticated over the course of the last generation in terms of its commercial capabilities within government. I think certainly when I joined the workforce, that probably wasn't the case, but that has happened over the last 25 years.
One of the questions coming through, which is a similar theme actually to Chris Money's session yesterday, where he spoke of the fact we've actually got a plethora of funding tools already available in the toolkit, but they're not necessarily being used. Again, an open one for the panel. Is that the same for financing? Have we got enough tools, we're just not using them? Or are there more tools or silver bullets that anyone would like to offer?
I'd probably say that the government has been trying to lean in this area, and I think it's now a great opportunity to try and take tools like IFF that we've heard about and give it the chance to develop and give the market the chance to test it further and innovate further with what we've been given. But like you said, it's hard when they're only given a short life. It doesn't give the tools that much time if we're taking them out with the political cycles.
I agree with Nahuia. I think one of the opportunity to take learnings from the IFF program as that develops is really key, and one of the interesting parts of that is the government support package component to it. Whether that can be rolled out on a broader basis to help sit behind social infrastructure financing would be something that would be pretty interesting to follow as we move through that program.
And Viewey Mark mentioned before the benefit, I guess, of putting these three social sectors together, that they derive benefits off each other if it's planned and organised together, perhaps when they're looking at procurement. And so one of the common themes and questions coming through from the audience is, are there opportunities for procuring agencies to seek co-funding from other agencies to achieve broader outcomes?
Yeah, one of the issues that I've dealt with before is the lack of coordination between social infrastructure procurers, where situations have arisen, certainly in my previous role, where we've just built a school, and community services have indicated that, in fact, if you built the school slightly differently, it might have met a whole range of needs that we now need to procure a separate building to do. So I think there is an opportunity, not always, but there's certainly an opportunity to, and this is the real challenge that we have from an infrastructure planning perspective, to ensure that we have communication and we actually connect up where we have opportunities for our social infrastructure to meet purposes which are beyond just the one procuring entity.
So more questions coming through. Thank you very much for the audience participation. Can we be honest about the current increased costs down the road for PPPs, both here and around the world? Future generations are going to be paying either way, surely.
I guess if you're comparing an increased cost to no spend on your asset, that might, that kind of gives you a different equation. So I think, sometimes we sort of compare the wrong things. We don't have the right benchmarks or the right context for what we spend on our existing assets using our ordinary government funding tools, and then re-spending again 40 years later. as opposed to spending on social infrastructure through a PPP vehicle that at the end of 25, 30 years, you've got an asset in a reasonable condition handed back to you. So, we do have some unfortunate kind of assumptions around, what we're comparing and what things truly cost. And I don't know if we actually, coming back to the outcomes question, I don't know if we really know what we're getting for how much, for how long, and when we're going to have to spend that all over again.
Another one for the panel. What can we do in the funding financing space to address inequality that Māori and Pacifica and other disadvantaged groups face in social infrastructure? And then if you think to procurement, how are we considering lifting Māori and Pacifica businesses in the trades as we're procuring social infrastructure? Any volunteers?
I mean, the government procurement rules already make it clear that the government is intent on leveraging procurement for broader outcomes that include support for Māori and Pacifica businesses, for workforce development and so on. I think at the moment in some of these procurements that we are still paying a bit of lip service to that. And so, but that's an area where some in the construction sector are being quite innovative and coming with some really good proposals. The really important thing is for the agencies procuring that infrastructure to value those proposals. If someone's coming with something that's really innovative around workforce and Māori and Pacifica businesses, but that's going to mean you're going to have to spend a little bit more. You don't value that. Then, frankly, it's kind of a waste of time. So I think we really need to value that and actually build that into our procurement. And if we pay a bit more, then that's good. And that is about creating those outcomes, and that is about ultimately measuring that. So, we need to get with the program on that one.
I guess that was already somewhat in the framework within the PPP model, that it wasn't just about the lowest price, it was about a broader social outcome. So it's expanding on that across all procurement.
Absolutely, yep.
Sorry, Peter.
No, I just want to be controversial for a second. Having been a Chief Procurement Officer, I just recognise that sometimes it's braver to fund the program than to try and achieve the objective through a procurement outcome. And the reason I say that is that people who are expert in to use my terminology, Indigenous issues, are actually not the same people who are expert in procurement. And often you're using a sledgehammer to try and drive through a social outcome that's very important, but you're not using the most skilled people to actually do it. So I've always held the view it's best to appropriate the program and yet get the people who are experts in it delivering it than trying to achieve that outcome through people who really don't know much about the subject matter, which is your typical procurement officer. So I know that's probably a controversial statement, but that's my view, that you're best off getting that done by the people who are experts in the subject matter.
Thank you. And a couple more coming through. So risk transfer and PPPs has seen contractors struggle to make a fair and reasonable return. Appetite for PPPs has dropped significantly as a result, not just from the public sector, but the private side as well. D&C contracts and risk transfer is also problematic. Is there a plan to make social development construction more appealing?
I can start off on this one. I'm not sure about the plan, but I'll talk about the broader issue. Mm-hmm. I think PPPs are at the brutal end of fixed price, fixed scope contracts. The construction market's had well-documented struggles over the last few years, and the construction sector accord is pulling us in a completely different direction to the PPP risk allocation. Right now, you won't get many D&C contractors who are asking where can they sign. So I think that the trick really there is if that market is to be sort of reconstituted or to start again, the Crown is going to need to think about the risk transfer that it takes, because neither equity nor debt are going to take any of the increased risks. As soon as we move away from a sort of full fixed price, fixed scope contract, the Crown is going to need to decide on if it's worthwhile doing, it's going to have to be worthwhile to take the risk that we are moving away from the construction contractors.
I think one last final one from the floor, and I think this is pretty squarely at you, Peter. What is Infracom's role in upskilling procuring agencies for social infrastructure?
I expected one of these to come through. So what we do is, this is actually quite an easy question, so I don't mind it at all. What we do is we partner with procuring agencies. We have a framework that we just approved around high value, high risk, where we look at projects that are complex and where there's great propensity for things to go wrong. If you look at the projects we've formally engaged in to support, they've all got their various reasons. There's accommodation and messing and dining for the New Zealand Defence Force, Scott-based redevelopment for Antarctica, New Zealand, and the plant biosecurity project for the Ministry of Primary Industries. So they all fit squarely in the high value, high risk model. And that's where we, being a very small organisation, we really have to triage our investment and our time and focus on where we think we can best get an outcome. And I describe Infracom, this is a very Aussie analogy, I have to say, but we're like Vegemite well served, spread very, very thinly across a whole range of projects. And we have to focus on where we can get the best value. So that's really where we're adding value as an organisation, partnering with the organisation, partnering with delivery agencies that really have complex projects that we can come in and support, not replace the commercial advisor, but supplement what they do.
Fantastic, thank you. And thanks everyone for your engagement today. That was one of the better sessions I think I've seen where there's been plenty of questions coming through. And thanks again to the Power Panel. I will call you that again. If we had a silver bullet, Hugh, we wouldn't be here discussing it. And that doesn't just apply to infrastructure funding and financing for social infrastructure, but all of the issues we're discussing here at the conference. So please join me in thanking our panellists today.
Thank you very much, panellists. I'm sure that's not all the questions that were ready to be asked in the room, and I would encourage the audience to head up to this power table up here with our ministry and panel speakers if you have any further questions. However, what we would like you all to do is get out the cell phones that you haven't been looking at during this session, open it up, and if you have not yet voted in this conference or you don't know how to do it, this is what you do. Open the app. Sean Wynne, open the app. Get your phone out. Jesse? Ross? You had your phone out before.
I couldn't do the Apple password.
Oh, rubbish. Honestly. Our millennial friends will help you. Okay, so everybody get your phone out. We are on the social infrastructure session. Have you found that? Click that. And down there you will see a poll. We have given you some options to consider. I would really love this session to have a great voter turnout. So the question that you're answering is what is needed to improve our social infrastructure? Is it more public funding, more options for private investment, a predictable and committed pipeline of projects? Oh, look at that. More central planning and delivery, or more devolution of planning and delivery to regional or local governments? See, Ross, if you could vote, that would look quite different, wouldn't it? Yeah. Fantastic. Well, look, thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you to our speakers and panellists. It was a very insightful session. This is not the end. I would encourage you to come and have a further chat with our speakers up here. But for those who are joining us for lunch in the afternoon, all sessions this afternoon will be in the plenary room downstairs. There are no sessions up here. Thank you for joining us, and please, a round of applause for our speakers. Excuse me, do we have our lunch sponsor programmed in the room? Is our lunch sponsor here today, Charles? Charles, did you want to come and say a quick couple of words? Sorry, we didn't know you were here. Charles is paying for lunch today, so we might give him a couple of moments.
Thank you.
That's all right. Sorry about that.
I thought I'd got out of that. Oh, that's great. I don't have to do a speech. Right, yeah. Tēnā koutou. My name's Charles Dodds. I'm the Senior Contracts Manager for Program Facility Management business here in New Zealand. Rebuild Nation has a particular meaning for Programmed. It's not only the infrastructure sector, but the harapuri whānui that we service across all our partnerships and the contracts and education through to infrastructure and many in between. We are well aware that social strengthening is required, even more so after the economic effects of COVID across the country. That's why at Program we have a diversity and inclusionary strategy, not only to create but to maintain a safe, sustainable and inclusive culture across business. We absolutely have to reflect our whānuis that we service and look to do that through working closely with our customers, suppliers and contractors. Also hearing firsthand where communities are in need and of assistance and training for employment and finding sustainable employment pathways. Programmed as a group has set a goal of 20% Māori representation, and I'm proud to say that we are halfway to that goal. But that doesn't mean we stop and rest. It spurs us on to expand our social inclusion even further. This we do utilising our partnerships with KiwiRail, Te Ahuri Moawai and many other customers throughout New Zealand. Thanks for your time.